Almost there, let me expand sign 5, the scene, and the closing dot close a bit more to comfortably clear 3,200. A candle is lit every Friday night in a house that has never once used the word Jewish. Nobody in that kitchen knows why the candle is lit. The grandmother who taught this to her daughter didn't know either. She only knew that her own grandmother did it too, quietly, with the curtains closed. And if anyone asked why, there was no answer, only silence. The family calls itself Catholic. They go to church every Sunday. They say the same prayers as their neighbors. And once a week, in a back room, away from the windows, a candle is lit for no reason anyone can explain. 500 years later, a simple DNA test would finally give that candle its name back. This is a story about the things families carry without knowing what they are carrying. A habit, a word, a way of cooking meat, a way of burying the dead. Small pieces of an old religion, hidden so deep inside daily life that the family itself forgot it was ever there. And this is also a story about DNA, because DNA remembers things that silence and fear could never fully erase. It doesn't matter how many generations tried to forget. The body keeps a record anyway. Here are 5 signs, some found in family habits, some found in genes, that keep showing up again and again when a family's Jewish roots have gone quiet but never fully disappeared. Most people think Jewish ancestry works like a light switch. Either it's there, written clearly in the family tree, or it isn't there at all. A grandparent, a great-grandparent, a clear paper record. Those are the only signs most people expect to find. If none of that exists, most people assume there is simply nothing to find. That idea usually breaks the moment someone opens a DNA report that was never meant to say anything about religion and finds ancestry pointing straight to the Middle East. Or a doctor mentions a gene linked to Jewish ancestry in a family that has never called itself Jewish. Or an ancestry test keeps showing a small piece of Jewish heritage inside a family that has spent 300 years believing it was something else completely. Polish, Mexican, Portuguese, anything but that. Family historians have a name for this gap. They call it the disappearing generation. It comes from one of the most painful events in Jewish history, the forced conversions that swept across Spain and Portugal, starting around 1391 and growing much worse after 1492, when Jews were ordered to convert to Christianity or leave the country. Many chose to leave everything behind rather than give up their faith, but thousands converted, at least on paper. Some of these families quietly kept practicing small pieces of Judaism in secret, generation after generation, without ever fully explaining why, even to their own children. Over time, even the secrecy faded. The meaning behind these small habits disappeared completely, leaving only the habit itself. Their children scattered across Latin America, the American Southwest, and back into Spain and Portugal, carrying old blood their own family stories never once mentioned. That is the history. Now here is what scientists have actually found, one careful study at a time. The first sign is simple. It's the ancestry result that won't let go of the Middle East. Many people take a DNA test and get a small, unexplained result, Ashkenazi Jewish or Sephardic Jewish, sitting inside a report that otherwise says Polish, Mexican, or Portuguese. Most people think it's a mistake, a rounding error, a glitch in the software. Usually it isn't. Ashkenazi Jewish communities went through something scientists call a founder event, around 600 to 800 years ago. This means their whole population, at one point, came from a very small group of people, maybe around 300, according to one major genetic study of hundreds of full genomes. Think of it like a small group of trees, all planted close together in one spot. Even hundreds of years later, all the branches still share the same roots, and you can see it in the wood if you know where to look. In the same way, people with Ashkenazi ancestry share unusually long, matching pieces of DNA with each other, even as total strangers who have never met, on opposite sides of the world. This pattern is so clear and so well studied that DNA tests can spot it, even when it is small, even after many generations of mixing with other groups. Sephardic ancestry is harder to spot this way because the mixing has gone on longer and spread wider, across Spain, Portugal, North Africa, and all of Latin America. But it still shows up. One well-known study from 2018 estimated that around 1 in 4 Hispanic and Latino people in the Americas may carry a small trace of Sephardic Jewish ancestry, a quiet echo of what happened after 1492. This number gets repeated a lot online, but it should be treated carefully. It comes from one study, using one particular method, and it carries real uncertainty. What is not in doubt is the pattern itself. Sephardic ancestry keeps showing up, again and again, in families that never once called themselves Jewish, and never expected to see that word in a lab report. Family historians studying this period have also found something else worth mentioning. Certain last names appear again and again in Old Spanish and Portuguese records connected to forced conversion and secret worship. Names like Cardoso, Franco, Henriquez, Núñez, Perez, and de la Torre, among many others. A name alone proves nothing, since these names were common everywhere, carried by old Christian families too. But when a family carries one of these names, and also shows Sephardic ancestry on a DNA test, and also keeps one of the unexplained customs we'll talk about later, researchers start to pay closer attention. None of these clues proves anything on its own, but 3 different clues, all pointing the same direction, stop looking like accident. The second sign lives only on one side of the family tree, father to father to father, going back generations without a break. And when it appears, it's very specific. Back in 1997, a scientist named Karl Skorecki discovered that many men who belonged to the Kohanim, the traditional Jewish priestly family said to come from Aaron in the Bible, shared the same pattern on their Y chromosome, the piece of DNA passed only from father to son, unchanged, generation after generation. This became known as the Cohen-Modal haplotype. Think of it almost like a very old family surname, but written in the body instead of on paper. Impossible to change and impossible to fake. A later study in 2009, using a much bigger set of genetic markers, found that this pattern shows up in close to 1/3 of Kohanim men across many different Jewish communities, is almost never found outside Jewish families, and seems to trace back around 3,000 years, a number that lines up strangely well with the biblical story, though scientists are careful to call this a coincidence in timing, not proof of the Bible itself. Here is where the story gets strange. That same Y chromosome pattern has shown up in families that have never called themselves Jewish at all, specifically in some Hispano families in New Mexico and southern Colorado, descendants of Spanish settlers who arrived there centuries ago under Spanish colonial rule. Just an old Spanish name, and a set of family habits nobody could ever fully explain. Not every scientist agrees on what this means, and it's worth being honest about that disagreement instead of hiding it. A 2006 study looked closely at this exact claim, testing DNA from 139 Spanish-American men across the region, and found their Y chromosomes were, statistically, no different from regular Spanish men living in Spain today. No clear sign of hidden Jewish ancestry at all. That study has not settled the argument, and probably never fully will. Both sides agree on one thing, though. This region really was settled, in part, by families fleeing forced conversion and religious persecution, and individual families keep getting matching results, generation after generation, completely on their own, often without knowing about each other's results at all. Maybe that's a real pattern hiding under the surface of the population. Or maybe it's a compelling story spreading faster than the evidence can keep up with. Nobody has closed the case either way, and honestly, nobody should pretend to. The third sign runs down the mother's side, mother to mother to mother, an unbroken line. And its discovery is almost eerie in how specific it turned out to be. In 2006, a researcher named Duran Bahar studied the DNA passed down only through mothers, called mitochondrial DNA, across Ashkenazi Jewish communities scattered all over Europe. He found something nobody expected going in. Almost 40% of all Ashkenazi maternal lines trace back to just 4 women. 4 specific genetic branches, staying almost unchanged for around 1,000 years, hardly mixing at all with the much larger non-Jewish population living all around them for that entire time. Where those 4 women originally came from is still argued about today, and it's a genuinely open question, not a settled one. Behar's team believed they came from the Middle East, carried west by early migration. But a competing study in 2013 argued the exact opposite, that these same 4 lines actually trace back to ancient Europe, meaning the founding mothers may have been European women who converted into Judaism at some point, rather than migrants who brought Middle Eastern ancestry with them. Two respected research teams looking at the exact same evidence, reaching completely opposite conclusions. Either way, the pattern itself is one of the most carefully documented in all of population genetics. If someone's maternal DNA test comes back matching one of these 4 specific groups, and their family has no known Jewish history at all, that result is connected to one of the best studied genetic patterns in the world. The 4th sign usually shows up somewhere unexpected, not in a family tree, but in a doctor's office, often during a routine pregnancy screening. Doctors and genetic counselors now regularly test for certain health conditions that are more common in people with Ashkenazi Jewish ancestry. Conditions like Tay-Sachs disease, Gaucher disease, and 2 specific gene changes linked to breast and ovarian cancer risk, known by the short names 185-DEL-AG and 5382-NC. These conditions don't care what a family calls itself or what religion is written on a birth certificate. They travel quietly through generations, long after a family has stopped thinking of itself as Jewish at all, sometimes for 200 or 300 years. The reason these conditions cluster this way comes back to the same small founding population we already talked about. When a group starts from a small number of people, and one of those people happens to carry a rare gene change, that gene change can end up much more common in every generation that follows, simply because there weren't enough other people in the group to dilute it back down over time. So when someone with no known Jewish ancestry tests positive for one of these specific gene changes, doctors don't see it as random chance. They see it as a clue worth following up on. Modern genetic testing panels built for Ashkenazi ancestry now cover more than a dozen conditions beyond just these 3, including familial dysautonomia, Canavan disease, and Niemann-Pick disease. And doctors in many countries recommend the full panel by default whenever a patient mentions even partial Ashkenazi background. It's also worth saying clearly, Jewish communities from North Africa, Persia, and other regions carry their own completely different genetic patterns, shaped by their own separate history and their own separate bottleneck. There is no single Jewish gene. There are several different founding stories, each one leaving its own distinct fingerprint behind. The 5th and final sign was never written in a lab at all. It's the sign families have carried the longest and doubted the most. Small, everyday habits nobody can explain, repeated so many times they stop looking strange. Lighting a candle every Friday night. Never eating pork, without ever calling it a religious rule, just something we don't do. Covering the mirrors in the house after a death in the family. Draining the blood from meat before cooking it, following a rule nobody remembers learning or being taught. Throwing away the first small piece of dough from a batch of bread instead of baking it with the rest. Spinning a small 4-sided top during a winter holiday that was supposed to be about something else entirely. Burying the dead quickly, within a single day, without the usual embalming, in places where embalming was the normal custom for everyone else. On their own, each of these looks like nothing more than a family quirk, a strange little habit passed down for no clear reason. But researchers who study crypto-Jewish and converso families across New Mexico, Portugal, and Latin America have found these exact same habits appearing again and again in completely unrelated families with no memory of Judaism at all. One historian, Stanley Hordes, who spent years studying this in the American Southwest, described it simply: it's passed down the way a scar is passed down. Nobody chooses it, nobody explains it, it just keeps showing up generation after generation on schedule. This is the one sign science can't fully measure on its own, no matter how good the lab equipment gets. But it's also the sign that makes the DNA results feel real, feel personal, feel like more than just numbers. A genetic marker is just a line on a page until someone in the family remembers the candle, and suddenly the page means something completely different. Put these 5 signs side by side, and a pattern starts to appear that no single sign could show on its own. An ancestry estimate pointing to the Levant, a Y chromosome pattern tied to an ancient priesthood, a maternal line tracing back to 4 specific women, a gene change that shows up on a routine medical test, and underneath all of it, quietly, a candle lit every Friday for reasons nobody ever explained. None of these signs was designed to work together. They come from completely different branches of science: population genetics, medical genetics, and oral family history, studied by different researchers in different decades for completely different reasons. And yet, again and again, in family after family, they keep landing on the exact same conclusion. Picture Father William Sanchez, a Catholic priest working in Albuquerque, years before his story became well known outside his own community. As a boy, his family spun small tops at Christmas, instead of doing what most families around them did at that time of year. They avoided pork, quietly, without ever calling it a rule, without ever writing it down anywhere. Nobody in the house used the word tradition out loud. Nobody used the word Jewish either, not once, not even in passing. As a child, he only noticed that something in his house was different from his friends' houses, without knowing what, and without anyone willing to explain it to him. Years later, as an adult, a simple DNA test tracing his father's line back through history came back showing the Cohen modal haplotype, that same rare, specific pattern linked to the ancient Jewish priesthood. A Catholic priest carrying the Y chromosome of a Jewish priestly family from a household that had spun tops at Christmas for 4 generations without ever once knowing why they did it. Now multiply that story by thousands of families across New Mexico, Colorado, and Latin America who have gone through the exact same quiet discovery, often completely alone, often with no idea other families were finding the same thing. What happened after 1492 wasn't a clean break between two religions, with one side simply replacing the other overnight. It was a slow fade, old rituals passed down without their meaning, generation after generation, carried forward by people who never knew what question their own bodies and their own kitchens were quietly holding the answer to the whole time. It's tempting to treat all 5 signs as one final, complete answer. DNA plus candle equals proven Jewish ancestry. Case closed, mystery fully solved. But the research doesn't work that way, and it doesn't work that way on purpose. The New Mexico Y chromosome debate is still unresolved, and honest researchers on both sides will say so. The true origin of the 4 founding mothers is still argued between 2 respected research teams who looked at the exact same evidence and still reached opposite conclusions. A small ancestry percentage can sometimes come from one distant relative, 5 or 6 generations back, and not represent a whole hidden family history at all. DNA gives us probability. It was never going to give anyone a clean, final verdict. What DNA does reliably give us is direction, a set of clues carefully studied by serious researchers that become much harder to dismiss once they line up with an unexplained family habit passed down quietly for generations without explanation. A candle lit every Friday isn't proof by itself. Neither is one genetic marker sitting alone in a report. But 500 years after an entire religion was ordered to disappear from an entire country, the fact that any of these signs survived at all, in blood, in bread, in a top spun at the wrong holiday, in a mirror covered for reasons nobody could ever fully name, says something that history was never fully able to erase, no matter how hard it tried, no matter how many generations it had to work with. And it raises one last question, quieter than any DNA percentage on any report. How many of these 5 signs would have to show up in your own family, on your own kitchen table, before it stopped looking like coincidence and started looking like history? Maybe it's just one sign, small and easy to dismiss. Maybe, if you look closely enough, it's 2 or 3, or all 5, quietly stacked on top of each other, waiting for someone to finally notice. The candle gets lit again this Friday, in that same kitchen, and this time, someone finally knows its name.